SoundCartel. HotPod has been the go-to industry newsletter on all things audio and podcasting since its inception in 2014. And in this episode, we talk to Ashley Carman, who recently took over as lead writer and editor of HotPod, about her views on the latest news and whether podcasting has earned the title of mainstream, or is the bubble about to burst?
I think for me to determine whether this is a bubble is going to depend on whether the ad revenue comes, whether more people are able to make a living off of podcasting, whether exclusives keep getting these big flashy deal amounts, like crazy deal amounts. And I mean, the pivot to video ended disastrously because as someone who worked in the media, there were a ton of layoffs. We lived the pivot to video. I don't want to have to live the pivot to audio, but we might.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 17 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hey Nick, great to be with you again.
Now, before we get to Ashley, I want to quickly discuss two topics. The first, video podcasts on Spotify and also YouTube, and whether Facebook is good for podcasts.
Yes.
So first, Nicole, Spotify is rolling out its video podcast capability to all of its users now. It was originally just for Spotify exclusives. However, you do have to upload via Anchor, which is the hosting platform that Spotify owns, and the videos are then only available on Spotify. So with that in mind, Nicole, do you think we should be busting a gut to do video versions of our podcasts for Spotify?
We've spoken about video podcasts before, and I think it's the same here to a degree. I think if you have the know-how, the technical ability, the time, absolutely go and do it. I think what's critical, though, is to make sure that your content is great, that you've got the audio and production going really well, and then investigate a video component. So I don't think it's critical to the success of a podcast, but if you have the time, energy, resources, go for it.
Yeah, it's always been a funny one for me because the concept of a video podcast to me flies in the face of a lot of the benefits of podcasting that we discuss in every episode of this series about the ability to multitask and all that kind of stuff. But then there's YouTube. Tom Webster from Edison Research actually discussed in his keynote at Podcast Movement earlier this year. Now, we love Tom Webster and we love what Edison Research does with their research every year. But what they've shown is that YouTube quite often comes up as the number one choice for where podcasters listen. So he dug a little deeper into this, and it actually made a lot of sense. YouTube is the go-to place for searching for things that you want to learn about, to educate yourself.
Yeah.
So if someone recommends a podcast to you, then it kind of makes sense that a lot of people, particularly those that aren't familiar with podcasting, would go to YouTube.
Yeah.
And for those that do like listening to podcasts on YouTube, they dug a little deeper into why that is, and the behaviours actually make sense. We're already on YouTube a lot, so why not just consume podcasts where we already are?
Yeah.
The YouTube algorithm is really clever as well. How many times, Nicole, have you watched one video and then suddenly you're watching another and another?
Well, it does explain why I have fallen down a YouTube rabbit hole in the last few years.
And a major premise of Tom's speech was around making our podcasts more recommendable.
Yeah.
Well, in a way, YouTube's actually doing the recommending itself through its algorithm, so it's doing some of the work for us. YouTube's become quite annoying with all of its ads, and so a lot of people pay for the premium versions that allow you to multitask, which we mentioned earlier. It's one of the features, and it kind of makes sense. If you're paying for something, then why not get best bang for your buck and listen to your podcast there as well? It also means from a producer point of view, you don't need to worry about whether they're an Android user or an iOS user because YouTube's for everybody.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of reasons. Tom didn't quite go as far as saying you must be on YouTube, but he got pretty close.
I think YouTube have hit the sweet spot of getting us algorithmically and also psychologically. I think if you pay for a subscription service, you kind of want to use it a little bit more, except perhaps if it's your gym membership, maybe. It doesn't translate to health and fitness. But the idea of recommendation is so important. And we know this, Nick, because word of mouth is still the number one way that people discover new podcasts. So if recommendation is their goal, they are killing it.
Yeah, and it's easy for people on YouTube to find content. It's a great platform. It's not so easy, as we discussed earlier, to produce a video version of your podcast. There are ways around that. You don't have to do a full video. You can do images and slides and different things, although, again, probably not going to be as engaging. If you're going to do it, you really should do it properly. But it's like a lot of the things we discuss, transcription. Probably should transcribe every podcast, yes. Should you be on YouTube? Probably. Yes. But it is a lot of work. So start where you've got the time and resources to do it properly.
Exactly.
But I think the evidence for why you should be on YouTube is starting to stack up, and Tom certainly made it very clear the way he presented it. It made a lot of sense.
It's compelling.
The other thing he mentioned is Facebook.
Yeah.
And we've talked many times here about when it comes to marketing your podcast, social media is a great place. Putting clips of your podcasts on social media makes sense because if you're going to be on Facebook for 5 minutes, you probably are not going to digest a 10,000-word blog or a 1-hour podcast, but you might be captured by a 30-second audio grab or audiogram that stands out with something that tickles your fancy. Tom also said that for those who don't listen to podcasts, 60% of that audience responded to their survey saying Facebook is their number one social platform. So it's a huge audience.
Massive.
Overall, yes, there are other social media platforms that are catching up and Facebook has perhaps been in decline. But overall, I mean, it's still a huge audience.
Yeah.
But Tom went one step further about what you could do on Facebook with your podcast. Do you want to explain that, Nicole?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just take a step back too. I mean, we talk a lot about attracting new audiences to podcasting because while there's a big percentage of people that are aware of podcasting and a decent number that are listening, there is a huge proportion of people that we can still reach. And if 60% of people who don't listen to podcasts are on Facebook, ding dong, I think that's where you need to be.
Well, in his presentation, he said we being podcast listeners, 6-7 hours of content a week, but we have a pretty full slate of shows in that time. So attracting someone who doesn't have a whole list of podcasts already in their playlist makes a lot of sense.
And Tom is absolutely right. He talks in this piece about creating a bespoke piece of content for Facebook. So not a clip.
It's like a standalone mini show.
Exactly. And smart marketers are already repurposing a single piece of content for different platforms anyway. Why not add this to the list? It's essentially, as Tom said, a 60-second ad, a bespoke piece of content. It starts conversations and you haven't had to pay Facebook for it. So why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah, and being a standalone piece of content means that you won't feel like you're joining a conversation that has already started. It's like it's been created for you, which again, you'll be more likely to share it. You're sort of jumping in at the ground floor. As he said, they use us, so time to use them back. I absolutely suggest that you watch the whole 27-minute piece that Tom did. It is brilliant. It's jam-packed full of great content.
Yeah.
And we'll link to that in the show notes, as we always do.
We will.
But let's get to Ashley.
Yes. Ashley Carman is a senior reporter at The Verge, the American technology blog, where she has covered a range of topics, including dating apps, hardware startups, and the broad creator economy. In 2018, Ashley started reporting on the audio industry, and she recently took over as the lead writer and editor of the podcasting newsletter Hot Pod, which is why we are particularly keen to pick her brain.
Welcome, Ashley, to Podcasting Essentials.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. First of all, congratulations on your new role as lead writer of Hot Pod. Since The Verge bought the newsletter just recently, how do you feel about writing for such a highly respected industry publication?
I'm really excited. I was always excited when my stories were featured in Hot Pod. That was always like a big moment for me. I was like, yay, Nick liked my story. So being on the other end of it, I am hyped. I'm hyped because it's like fun for me because I get to nerd out about all the things I care about in the podcasting industry. Whereas previously with TheVerge.com, luckily they afforded me the opportunity to just cover podcasting full time. But the stories I wrote really had a broad focus, and there were sometimes industry news that was like, this is important and I care about it, and I know people in the industry care about it. It's just not going to work on TheVerge.com. So I'm so happy that we now have a place where I can put that news and talk about it with the people who really care and reach that readership.
Now, 4 years ago, Nick Qua was actually our second ever guest on this podcast back in season 1 in 2017. Back then, there were only 60 million active listeners to podcasts in the US, and Nick estimated that the industry was valued somewhere around just under 100 million. But he thought it would move towards 200 million over the next couple of years. So, update time. Where are we now on these stats?
So, in the US, we have the Interactive Advertising Bureau, and they always are putting out their yearly stats about podcasting. So this past year, they put out their most recent report, and they estimated that in the US, podcast ad revenue would exceed $1 billion this year. And then ideally, it would be reaching $2 billion by 2023, so in a couple years. That is just like wild growth pretty quickly.
Podcasting was a long way from mainstream in 2017, with technology and awareness the major factors holding us back from mass consumption. We're constantly working to overcome technology and discoverability barriers, but do you think it's fair to say that podcasting is now mainstream?
Yeah, I think so. I am sure that you would have someone come on this show and tell you there's so many untapped listeners of podcasts, and that is true. But I would say as far as the word podcast, people know what it is. Like I'm watching a Hulu show right now that is literally about podcasting with Steve Martin and Martin Short. I'm sure you guys have heard about this.
Yeah.
It's big in the US.
All Murders in the Building or something.
Yeah, Only Murders in the Building. So that to me is like, wow, that's a moment. It's a podcasting show. But as far as could there always be more listeners? Yes. Like there are definitely people who don't listen to podcasts, maybe don't even know how to access a podcast. And that is the thing. But I would say as far as just the concept of a podcast, at least in the US, know what that is by now.
Ashley, brands all over the world are now experimenting with podcasting in a range of different ways, which is fantastic. Why is podcasting an attractive medium for brands, do you think? And where are the biggest opportunities right now?
Yeah. So I know whenever people talk about the perks of podcasting, it's like, oh, the voice is so intimate. You really get to know the people. You have a parasocial relationship and whatnot. And I agree with that, of course. Like that's true too. I just also think that the traditional means of advertising, whether that is display or like on the web or like a billboard or television commercial, I really feel like my brain doesn't even register display ads anymore. Like I just somehow glaze over it. And Instagram, I swipe over. I'm just like, nope. And billboards, I guess I'm seeing, but I'm not presumably spending too much time thinking about it. But I think podcasting is still one way that you can kind of get your message in front of people. And they might even be intrigued. I know people say the host-read ad really does lure people in. If you do it right, can keep them interested. And also if the podcast itself is a branded podcast, like the Trader Joe's podcast, I think is a good example. If you do it well, people actually might really just be passionate about your community and want to talk about it. And I know because you already are activating this super interested group of people.
Ashley, you cover a lot of news in Hot Pod, so we can't deep dive into absolutely everything that's going on, but we'd love to get your views on some of the major points of interest. So here goes. Let's start with the obvious one. Who's winning the battle between Apple and Spotify? And what are the major differences in their strategies?
As far as who is winning the battle for listeners, it is really tough to say. But their strategies are really different. Apple has just recently launched their subscriptions, which Apple is monetizing the creators because the creators have to give them a cut of whatever subscription revenue they make and also pay to be on their back end hosting those podcasts. Whereas Spotify has gone both for the creators, but also for the listeners. And the way it's done that is both offering these hosting services, like acquiring hosting services and creation software like Anchor and Megaphone, but also for the listeners trying to, 1, invest in the app, 2, get them to subscribe, and 3, monetize their listens by selling ads. And of course, inking deals with mega stars to try to bring them to the app. We don't really see Apple doing that like much at all. We've really seen them mostly focus on using podcasts of their own to promote their Apple TV Plus content. So they have a podcast for their new Foundation show. The new Jon Stewart will have a podcast. So I don't know, we might see that eventually.
You mentioned that Apple Podcasts have launched their paid subscription service. Apart from the complications over the word subscribe, which has always been a word for free listening, how is the paid subscription platform taking off?
So it's been tricky because people haven't really released their numbers, of course. But we've seen little tidbits come out. There's been some independent creators who have said that actually they are doing decently well on there. Like they're happy with the performance. We recently heard about Bad Blood, the final chapter, which is the Theranos trial happening here in the US. The host of that, John Carreyrou, he shared his numbers for their premium podcast, 2 million monthly downloads and 6,000 monthly paying subscribers. So the conversion rate isn't great, but I think it's still impressive because this is a new behavior, both culturally, like the idea of I pay for podcasts, but also just as an in-app feature, like people might not even know it exists. Like we're in the industry, we know, but like some people might not. And so to me, I was like, 6,000 seems really good, actually. So we're seeing little bits here and there. I will be definitely hoping more people share numbers in the weeks and months and years to come, but it seems like it's doing okay.
And that's $25,000 worth of revenue per month, if I've done the maths correctly, that they didn't have prior to having that ability, or they would have had to have built their own ecosystem and paywall themselves. So there's got to be a benefit there, I guess. Now, Clubhouse has risen quickly in popularity, perhaps aided by the COVID pandemic, but it also feels like it's stalling a little bit now. What do you think the future is for these live audio rooms, which are popping up on several platforms? Can they find a sustainable business model and coexist alongside podcasting?
Yeah, that's the big question. I'm sure in some way, maybe they will be able to. I think it is really tricky to program advertising against live audio. So it might have to come from something else, like maybe Clubhouse or some other platform does its own distributing of podcasts and does a recording feature where it sells the ads on them. Maybe it does its own creators meetups and events where it actually has an events business, but it's really tied to this community. But as far as whether these apps themselves can succeed, I really see it as very low stakes, just chat time with your friends or strangers. But then you might have some of these like media outlets who are professional and know what they're doing with live performance, which is what it is. It takes a lot of work. It's not something that can usually happen sporadically and go really, really well. They might invest in it simply to drive people back to the thing that does make them money, which is like, oh, let's have a live discussion about this article we wrote or this investigation, or maybe our podcast that we put out. Maybe we should just have like a little fan time and talk to our fans for a little while. So something like that, like I could see it kind of augmenting things that are already happening.
Well, podcasting started out as predominantly an open ecosystem, with the majority of podcasts being produced by indie creators. But the open nature feels like it's closing a little bit. Would you agree with that? And where does it move to in the next few years?
Yeah, well, Spotify has definitely tried to use exclusives and really not relying on RSS to keep people in its ecosystem. It has been encouraging to see that they have this open access technology that they're working on that would allow podcasters who run subscriptions to also bring it into the Spotify app more easily. But no, I mean, they don't rely on RSS, and presumably there will be other apps that follow in its footsteps. Audible is a good example. They're doing their own thing completely, and I will be curious to see what Amazon Music does. I'll be curious to see what Facebook does. Apple, I feel like, will probably be pretty committed to the open ecosystem, at least right now, but we will see. So it does feel like people are tightening it. And I don't know if we're ever going to go back to wide open, but maybe we'll see how the exclusives work out.
Do you think that that's going to have an impact on indie creators and perhaps stifle some of their attempts at podcasting?
Yeah, I really worry about it from a labor perspective. For example, the subscriptions, just looking at that, it's really difficult right now. You have to distribute through Apple's backend by itself. If you run a Patreon, you have to do Patreon. If you have your hosting, you have to host and put your podcast there as well. And if Spotify starts doing its own thing, then you would also be uploading to Spotify. And who knows where else. And also just making that content is also a lot of work, to edit out the ads, to create extra content to entice people to subscribe. So I do think that as the market, I guess, sophisticates, we might see a bit more work for indie podcasters and maybe more of a struggle to find a place in the ecosystem. I do worry about it, and that's actually a very prominent theme I'm thinking about for the newsletter.
Now, in your first newsletter as lead writer of Hot Pod, you posed a question that you didn't actually answer, so I'm hoping you'll do that for me now. And that was, are we experiencing a pivot to audio that ends like the disastrous pivot to video? Is this a bubble?
Well, I don't have the answer yet. This is the big question. I think for me to determine whether this is a bubble is going to depend on whether the ad revenue comes, whether more people are able to make a living off of podcasting, whether exclusives keep getting these big flashy deal amounts, like crazy deal amounts. And I mean, the pivot to video ended disastrously because, as someone who worked in the media, there were a ton of layoffs. We lived the pivot to video. I don't want to have to live the pivot to audio, but we might.
Now, it would be remiss of us not to ask you about the brilliant article that you wrote for The Verge titled The Podcasting Hype House from Hell, How China's Biggest Audio Platform Funded One Man's Frat Boy Dreams. I mean, if that title doesn't get you reading, nothing will. And it was genuinely a jaw-dropping read, I have to say. Just for some context for listeners who haven't read it, it's the story of Peter Vincer and his outrageous antics during his time with Chinese podcast app Himalaya. Ashley, please can you tell our listeners the story and where it's all at now?
Yeah, so I will try to give you the very abbreviated version because this is a very long feature. But long story short, Himalaya is the name of China's biggest podcasting app, and they're huge in China, and I think they wanted to try to make their way in the US, so they launched an app here in 2019 called Himalaya. And Himalaya was doing its thing, exclusive podcast type strategy, subscriptions. They wanted to be a paid platform, essentially. And eventually they spun out this company called Hi Studios and put this man you just mentioned, Peter Vincer, in charge. To the outside, things were doing fine until March of 2020, when there was a mysterious press release that came out that basically just said, like, Hi Studios and Himalaya are no more. Hi Studios is now Notorious, LLC or something. And that's where you would have seen it. But on the inside, what was actually happening was a very toxic workplace, crazy parties that just are very out of place with the podcasting and also just the professional world. Like an ice sculpture bong makes an appearance. And podcasters themselves alleging that they had not been paid. So really, it's just kind of a spiral of despair and a hot mess, to put it lightly.
Yeah. So
since then, Peter has Notorious. I don't know what they're up to. I think they're still doing stuff. But Himalaya still exists in the US. Himalaya, actually, I just had this as a scoop in my Hot Pod Insider, that Himalaya has a new CEO, and they've recently pivoted their strategy to focus more on short form, inspirational content, telling like life stories of inspirational people. It's paid content. They were previously doing kind of masterclass adjacent stuff, but now they've pivoted again. So maybe that's the magic pivot. I don't know, but that's what it is.
Interesting. No more frat parties.
No more big
Himalaya.
parties, though.
I would be shocked if I got an invitation to a Himalaya party, but if I did, I would go.
Now, final question, Ashley. It's been a hell of a ride over the last few years in podcasting. What do we need to strap in for next? What are the biggest changes coming, and what can we look forward to as brands, producers, and listeners?
Yeah, so I kind of hinted at this one earlier, but really I think a big story for me, and one I think is just going to increasingly be of discussion, is big tech entering podcasting. What does it mean? What are they doing? Is it even working? Why are they doing this? A lot of it has to do with ad revenue. So presumably they just see an opportunity to make some money there. As for advertisers and brands who are making shows, we discussed indie podcasters potentially struggling for a little spotlight and making it. And I imagine that if brands already were struggling to get listeners, it's not going to get any easier. So I think discovery and promotion and how people get listens is going to also become an important part of the equation here. And big tech actually, in some ways, might solve some of that if they can figure out how to apply their discovery algorithms, which I'm not saying is a good thing. I'm just putting it out there that like they might actually do some work there. But I do think that it's kind of all going to go hand in hand, and it's going to be a lot of different stories all happening at once.
The move towards mainstream continues.
Exactly. Yeah. That will be really interesting to revisit our conversation in like 2 years or something.
Yeah, let's not leave it 4 years this time.
Yeah, that's a long time.
So thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials. All the very best with continuing writing of the Hot Pod newsletter. Just quickly, where can we find it?
You can find it at hotpodnews.com.
Thank you, Ashley. It's been brilliant. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Nick, I'd like to say first that for those not already subscribed to Hot Pod, it's an industry must.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are free versions and a paid version.
Yeah.
Now, at the top of this episode, my tongue was firmly in the side of my mouth when I posed, has podcasting reached mainstream? Because of course it has.
Yeah.
And when it comes to being a bubble, well, Ashley might not have wanted to sound definitive because of her role, but I'm extremely confident to predict that we are still in the early days of this new golden age of audio.
It is a really exciting time, and it's so crazy to think that just 4 years ago, when the founder of Hot Pod, Nick Qua, was on this podcast, there were no podcasts on Spotify, Google and Amazon were not players, ad revenue was less than a tenth of what it is today.
And there were no podcasts about COVID. Can you imagine a world without podcasts about COVID?
Pandemic, what? It's true. Awareness, listenership, and the sheer number of podcasts are all growing year on year. We know this with the data coming in. So I predict Ashley is going to have plenty to write about in the coming years.
Yeah, she sure is. And as she mentioned, when big tech enters the industry and continues to do so, they bring advancements in a whole range of things, but importantly, discoverability has been a big focus recently. But what will be interesting is, will the very fabric of the industry change at the same time?
Such a deep question, Nick, to end the show.
For up-to-the-minute answers, make sure you do subscribe to Hot Pod. Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Nick.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at SoundCartelAU. From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.
SoundCartel.